some women spend their whole lives being watched before they ever learn how to watch for themselves. Mara Ellison was one of them. At 46, sitting in a quiet kitchen in upstate New York with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, she finally decided to say out loud what she had carried in silence for over a decade. This is her story, not as the tabloids told it, not as the fan forums debated it, but as she remembers living it. Mara grew up in a small town in central Ohio, the middle child of 3 in a family that valued discipline as much as warmth. Her father drove a delivery route for a regional grocery chain. Her mother taught piano lessons out of their living room on weekday afternoons. It was not a glamorous childhood, but it was a stable one, built on church potlucks, report cards taped to the refrigerator, and a rule that dinner happened at 6 o'clock whether or not anyone felt like eating together. Mara was a serious student, the kind of kid who read ahead in her textbooks out of boredom rather than ambition. Acting found her almost by accident, through a community theater production her drama teacher begged her to audition for. She got the lead. She was terrible, by her own later admission, but something about standing under those hot stage lights, becoming someone else for 2 hours, felt like the only place she could exhale. By 19 she had a talent agent, a headshot she hated, and a one-way plane ticket to Los Angeles that her parents paid for reluctantly, on the condition that she'd come home if it didn't work out within a year. It worked out. A small role in an independent film led to a bigger role in a network drama, and within 18 months Mara Ellison's face was recognizable enough that she couldn't get through an airport without being stopped. She was, by every external measure, exactly where she'd dreamed of being. She was also, by her own later account, profoundly unprepared for what fame would ask of her. She met Julian Kessler at an industry gala in the spring, the kind of event where everyone is performing ease they don't feel. Julian was 20 years her senior, an A-list leading man whose career had spanned 3 decades and who carried himself with the specific gravity of a man who has never once had to wait in line. Mara would later say that what struck her most, in that first conversation, wasn't his fame. She'd met famous people before, but the intensity of his attention. He asked her questions and appeared to actually listen to the answers. He remembered small details from things she'd said in interviews years earlier. It felt, she said, like being truly seen for the first time in her adult life, and she didn't yet have the vocabulary to recognize that being seen that closely, that quickly, by someone with that much power, could also be its own kind of warning sign. Their courtship moved at a pace that stunned even people accustomed to Hollywood's compressed timelines. Weeks, not months. There were grand gestures, flights arranged on short notice, a proposal in a European capital that made international news within hours. Mara has said that at the time, she experienced it as romantic, even magical. Looking back, she describes it differently, as a kind of velocity designed to outrun her own doubts before they had time to form. When everything is moving that fast, she said, you don't get the space to ask yourself the questions you'd normally ask. And I think that was the point, even if neither of us understood it that way at the time. It was during this same period that Mara was introduced to the Ascendancy Institute, the organization Julian had belonged to since his 20s. He described it to her, at first, in language that sounded almost like self-help, a framework for personal clarity, a community of disciplined, purposeful people, a philosophy that had helped him survive a difficult childhood and build the career he had. Mara, raised in a household that took faith seriously but never rigidly, was curious rather than resistant. She enrolled in an introductory course. She found the early sessions intellectually engaging, even useful. What she did not immediately understand was how the organization structure worked, how each level of involvement required a new commitment, a new fee, a new set of relationships to cultivate inside the community and, correspondingly, a new distance from relationships outside it. The wedding was, by any account, an extraordinary event, a centuries-old European estate, hundreds of guests, a level of production that turned a private commitment into a global media spectacle. Mara has said she barely remembers parts of the day itself, that it passed in a blur of choreography she didn't feel she'd had much say in. I kept thinking, this is supposed to be the best day of my life, and I feel like a guest at my own wedding, she said. I didn't say that to anyone. I wasn't even sure I was allowed to think it. The years that followed are the ones Mara has been most reluctant to discuss publicly until now, and even now, she is careful. She describes a marriage that, from the outside, appeared charmed, and from the inside, felt increasingly narrow. Her schedule, she says, became something that was managed rather than chosen. Trusted friends from before the marriage gradually stopped being part of her daily life, not through any single dramatic rupture but through a slow attrition of invitations that didn't come and calls that went unreturned by people around her, not by her. She describes an atmosphere in which loyalty to the marriage and loyalty to the organization became difficult to separate, and in which expressing doubt about either felt, functionally, like the same forbidden act. The birth of her daughter, whom she calls Ren in this account to protect her privacy, changed the shape of Mara's fear without changing its substance. Before her, I could tell myself I was choosing this life for myself, and if it was hard, that was my business, she said. Once she existed, I couldn't tell myself that story anymore. I had to start asking what kind of life I was choosing for her, not just for me. She describes watching the organization structures extend toward her daughter, the expectation that Ren would eventually be enrolled in the same courses, raised inside the same worldview, and feeling a fear that was different from anything she'd experienced on her own behalf. I could live with sacrificing my own freedom. I found I could not live with sacrificing hers. What finally moved Mara from private doubt to action, she says, was not one single event but an accumulation that reached a threshold. There was a trip abroad, ostensibly for work, during which she found herself with an unusual amount of unsupervised time. She describes sitting alone in a hotel room and, for the first time in years, allowing herself to fully articulate a thought she'd been suppressing. "I am afraid of my own life, and I don't know how to say that to anyone." From there, she says, the planning began, carefully, quietly, and with the help of exactly two people she trusted completely. One was a family friend from Ohio, someone with no connection to Hollywood or to the organization, who helped her find attorneys in a different state under an arrangement designed to avoid detection. The other was a woman Mara refers to only as someone who had been through something similar. This woman, a former spouse of another prominent member of the same community, had gone through her own difficult separation years earlier and understood, in granular and painful detail, what Mara was up against. "She didn't tell me what to do," Mara said. "She just told me I wasn't crazy for being scared, and that there was a way through it. Sometimes that's the only thing you actually need someone to say to you." The logistics of leaving, Mara says, took weeks to arrange and mere days to execute. She filed in a jurisdiction chosen deliberately for its legal posture on custody, rather than in the state where the couple had spent most of their married life. She retained multiple law firms in advance, in different states, partly as a genuine legal strategy and partly, she admits now, as a way of feeling less powerless in a situation where she had felt powerless for years. She used a rotation of temporary phones for sensitive calls, not because she believed anyone was literally listening. She is careful to say she cannot prove that, but because the culture of the marriage had trained her to assume that privacy required active effort rather than being a given. When she finally called Julian to tell him the marriage was over, she says, she had already retained legal counsel in 3 different states. "I know how that sounds," she said. "Cold. Calculated. But I want to be honest, it wasn't coldness. It was terror translated into paperwork. Paperwork was the only language I trusted to protect us." The divorce, when it became public, moved with unusual speed, a matter of days between filing and settlement, a pace that surprised legal commentators at the time and that Mara attributes to both parties' shared desire to avoid a prolonged public battle over their daughter. The financial terms were resolved privately. Mara has never discussed specific figures publicly and declined to do so now, saying only that her priority throughout the process was securing stability and privacy for Ren, not maximizing any settlement. What she has been willing to discuss is the emotional cost of extracting herself and her daughter from a world that had, for years, functioned as the entirety of her social and spiritual universe. In the years since, Mara has rebuilt a life that looks, by her own description, almost aggressively ordinary. She lives in a house with a kitchen table where she and Ren eat dinner most nights, no production, no choreography. She has reconnected with childhood friends who had drifted away during her marriage, several of whom she says never fully understood what had happened until she began, slowly, to explain it to them. She returned, tentatively at first, to the Catholic faith of her childhood, describing it not as a rejection of spirituality altogether, but as a return to something that had never asked her to sever ties with the people who loved her. She has watched, from a careful distance, as other women who left the same community have told fragments of their own stories publicly, accounts of surveillance, of estrangement from family, of the particular psychological pressure that comes from being both deeply loved and constantly monitored within a closed system. Hearing those accounts, Mara says, was validating in a way she hadn't expected. "For a long time I thought maybe I was exaggerating it in my own head, the way you sometimes convince yourself your own pain wasn't really that bad. Then I'd hear another woman describe something almost identical to what I went through, down to small details, and I'd realize, no, this was real. This was a pattern, not a personal failing. Asked why she chose now, at 46, to speak more openly about those years, Mara pauses for a long time before answering. "Ren is old enough now to ask her own questions," she said finally. "And I decided a long time ago that when she asked, I wasn't going to lie to her, and I wasn't going to make her piece it together from magazine articles either. I wanted her to hear it from me first, in a form that was actually true. Everything else, anyone else hearing it, that's just a byproduct of that decision." She is careful, throughout, to draw a distinction between her own experience and any blanket condemnation of belief itself. "I'm not trying to tell anyone what to believe," she said. "Plenty of people found real peace in that community, and I don't think that makes them foolish. What I'm trying to describe is something narrower and, I think, more dangerous. What happens when a belief system and a marriage and a family's entire social world all collapse into the same structure, so that questioning any one of them means risking all three? That collapsing is what I couldn't survive inside of. That's the part one needed to leave." Julian, for his part, has never publicly disputed the broad outline of Mara's account, though he has occasionally pushed back on specific characterizations in interviews over the years, generally defending both his own conduct and the organization he remains part of. Mara says she has made peace with the fact that their two accounts of the same years will likely never fully align. "We were both telling the truth as we experienced it," she said. "I don't need him to agree with my version for my version to be true." Today, Ren is a teenager who Mara describes as funny, private, and fiercely protective of her mother, a description that seems, in its own quiet way, to close a kind of loop. The daughter who was once the reason Mara felt she couldn't leave has become, in adulthood's slower unfolding, one of the people who most clearly understands why she did. Toward the end of the conversation, Mara is asked what she would say to someone, a young actress, a young bride, anyone, standing where she once stood, dazzled by attention that moves faster than their own instincts can process it. She considers the question seriously. "I'd tell her that if something in you feels afraid to ask a question out loud, that fear is information," she said. "Not proof that anything is wrong, necessarily, but information. And you owe it to yourself to sit with that fear instead of outrunning it, the way I let myself get swept along and outrun mine for longer than I should have. It took me years to learn how to slow down enough to ask myself what I actually wanted, instead of what I was being offered. I'd want her to learn that faster than I did." Outside, the upstate light was starting to fade into early evening. Mara glanced toward the hallway, where, faintly, the sound of a television could be heard from another room, her daughter, home from school, doing something ordinary on an ordinary afternoon. It was, Mara said, still the thing she was proudest of. Not the career, not the tabloid chapter that had once defined her to strangers, but this, an unremarkable house where nobody was watching, and nobody needed to be.